San Francisco, they cited that for every one person who exits the system into that permanent housing, 4 become homeless. Well, you don't have to be a math genius to know that's not going to work.
Elizabeth Funk is a pioneering impact investor and nonprofit board member, and the CEO of DignityMoves, a leader in addressing homelessness in California. Elizabeth Funk, welcome to State of Gold.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yes, I'm so glad we're doing this. I want to start with this issue writ large, get right into it. I believe that the Newsom administration has earmarked $24 billion for homelessness in the last 6 years since he's been in office. But the problem is worse than ever. Why is the problem worse after so much money has been spent?
Isn't it crazy? That's really the fundamental situation. We keep spending more and more money and the problem keeps getting worse. So obviously, we're doing something wrong. Start there. And California has a particular version of the problem, which is unsheltered homeless. And I don't know that people understand that those are not synonymous. That nationally, if someone doesn't have a permanent home, they're at least in some form of shelter. And in California, we have 1 shelter bed for every 3 who want one, much less need one. And so you see it much more visibly on the streets. And that particular disconnect is a policy choice.
So elaborate. Why is it a policy choice across California that we have 1 shelter bed for every 3 unsheltered people?
So if you think about it, when people come off of the streets into something that's temporary or a shelter or what we call interim housing, they're still homeless. And so technically, the only solution to homelessness that ends homelessness is permanent housing. And so a jurisdiction that is scoring its department on reducing homelessness wouldn't want to squander money on something that doesn't actually solve the problem. That's kind of the fundamental thinking. And in the old days, where we had shelter and permanent housing, then you obviously want to put people primarily as much as you can in permanent housing because shelter doesn't solve things. But in California, the average cost per unit to build a single unit of that permanent housing is about $1 million in our big cities. Statewide, an estimate is maybe 850,000. Nationally, it's 300,000. So if California is going to try to build its way out of this problem with permanent housing, you see how the math doesn't work. And actually, in San Francisco, they cited that for every one person who exits the system into that permanent housing, 4 become homeless. Well, you don't have to be a math genius to know that's not going to work, right? And so we're in this sort of philosophical place where everybody deserves a permanent apartment, and interim housing or shelter is a waste of resources. And so a city, in a perverse way, would rather get 1 person into that $1 million apartment than 50 off of the streets into something temporary because their metrics are wrong. Now, that gives me optimism because metrics can be changed with the stroke of a pen, right? And I think, when I started this organization, Dignity Moves, there were sort of 3 aha moments that just lined up for me. And I thought, oh my God, this is solvable. And we have to solve it. And those 3 were that, first of all, when people first become homeless, only about 17% have a serious mental or behavioral health issue, less than 20% that cause them to lose their housing. 4 weeks later, that's doubled. And the average wait time in San Francisco for that permanent housing is about a decade, right? So we have allowed those people to be traumatized, quite frankly, beyond repair in a lot of cases. But the second thing is that when people are on the streets, we don't realize how much that costs us because it's scattered across so many departments that you don't see it. The cost to clean up feces and needles, the environmental remediation, the emergency room visits, all of those things add up to maybe $80,000 per year per person. But that's carried by all those other stakeholders. And the one department that has the power and the authority to end homelessness doesn't have the motivation to get them off of the streets. In a very simplistic framework. Now, obviously, we'll talk about how that's changing, but that's where we've ended up with this problem.
Wow. It's a mix of the wrong incentives and the wrong policies with a huge number of people caught in the middle. And that stat that you mentioned, that 17% start mentally ill and that doubles to 35% within a month, that is shocking. That is absolutely shocking. That the trauma that these people are experiencing because the policy is so bad, that's just so sad.
If you think about it, when somebody first loses their job, I mean, they had a home yesterday, right? And the number one cause is job loss. It's about 25%. The number 2 is divorce and separation, right? These are real people who are struggling to make ends meet, but they were self-sufficient. And then you're on the streets and it doesn't take long, right? I'll tell you a story about a woman that is one of our Dignity Moves communities where she was in a domestic violence situation and she left. And as with most domestic violence survivors, she'd long since been cut off from all of her support network. She didn't have anybody to call. She certainly wasn't going to go to a shelter. First, she knew it wouldn't be available. But secondly, that scared her, understandably. So she slept on the streets and she said the first night she was terrified to fall asleep, so she drank all the coffee she could get in her. And she drifted off anyway. The next morning, she woke up and she wandered over to the Tenderloin and started asking, where can I find this thing they call meth? Because she knew that it would be safer than falling asleep. And by the time she came to us, I met her. She had her 30-day Narcotics Anonymous chip. She'd been connected to a doctor who'd given her methadone, and she was trying, but it was going to be a long fight. And she said, I never used drugs. I didn't have to, but I had to stay alive. Just
Wow.
think about extrapolating that story thousands of times.
Wow, wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful. Can we talk about this policy disconnect? We know that in California, and I'm sure in other states in the union, we have a homeless industrial complex. We have an architecture of policy, nonprofits, and organizations that have grown up around serving the homeless population either by trying to get that permanent housing built, right? 850,000 to a million a unit, can't do those fast enough, not the right solution. And then the shelter network that I know a lot of people are scared to be a part of. They don't have any privacy. There's violence, there's drug use, etc. Why have we gotten to a place where this is the architecture that is serving these poor people on the street? What has caused this current construct?
The problem is that when people first become homeless, if they're going to be destined for a decade on the streets, the assumption that they're going to need supportive housing is a very good assumption, right? And so when we get you into the system, it gets you on those waiting lists, and we need to assume the taxpayer will pay for that person for the rest of their lives. That's what's fundamentally broken. And yet, the shelter system, first, we invest as little as we can in shelter, because to be clear, shelter doesn't work. It gets you out of the elements, but it's not a place where somebody's going to be able to think about what are probably some pretty big life challenges, right? When you need to be out the next morning, you're sleeping on a bunk bed next to strangers. It's just not a place where you can get out of, what we learned is sort of fight or flight mode,
The
survival
cycle,
mode,
the
right?
cycle.
We learned in
Yeah.
eighth grade science that your blood doesn't even go to the decision making parts of your brain when you're in that mode. So, of course, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. So, obviously, the cost of housing in general, and we do need to solve homelessness. We've got to solve our housing crisis, point blank. There needs to be enough affordable housing. But if we can get people indoors early, then that could be affordable housing rather than supportive housing, right? And so when I think about it, I think first and foremost, we just need to get people indoors. It's costing us twice as much to let them be on the streets because on average, it's maybe $80,000 a year per person. And yet to get them indoors with 3 meals a day and care and a roof over their heads is about 40,000. So as a society, we can't afford to allow this to happen. But secondly, when people get indoors, now they have a chance of returning to being self-sufficient. With a shower and a bed and a place to plug in a laptop, some good percent of those folks can get back on their feet. And what makes me the saddest is that we're losing that human potential. They estimate that even if only half of the people had a job at $15,000 a year, we're foregoing about $1 billion of wages per year for people who could be contributing members of society and
Mhm.
aren't. So when I started Dignity Moves, I started looking at this and saying, metrics aside, because with all due respect, those are their metrics, not mine. I don't think we need to score on whether someone has got a permanent home because, quite frankly, nothing in life is permanent. I'm not going to be here permanently, right? I don't know what permanent means, right? It just is a contrary term to the shelter or the temporary shelter. But if we could score ourselves instead by the number of nights spent languishing on our streets per year, now all of a sudden cities would be interested in getting people indoors. So I started looking at why can't we get people indoors? And you start with the assumption we're going to get everyone indoors and work backwards rather than telling yourself it's not possible, because that's, I think, the biggest thing standing in our way is we've told ourselves it's not possible. Yes, it is.
Yes. I was going to say, and indoors in the right situation, which is, I know, and I love that dignity is the operative word in your nonprofit's name because it's indoors with dignity as opposed to indoors in a shelter, which is not a place people can plan their next steps and get the services they need. Let's talk about your solution. You've got 10 sites so far. I'm sure you're planning a huge multiple of that, right? Because this is working. Let's go inside one of your sites, for example, Via del Oro in San Jose, which has become well publicized, successful. What is it like there? What are the component parts? Why is it working?
Well, first, let's talk about how it came to be, because I think that's what's the most interesting. And when you look at what would it take to get everyone indoors and you start looking at those hurdles, the first is people don't want a bunk bed with strangers. Okay, great. Then everybody's going to get their own room with a door that locks. Fundamental. The second is land is expensive. But if you drive around, there's a lot of vacant land out there that's not being used today, that's being saved for something someday. So in this case, it's a piece of land owned by a developer in San Jose, John Sobrato. He doesn't have plans for it in the meantime, so we borrow it for $1 a year, right? There goes the land cost. Then you look at the construction costs at $1 million a unit in California. And yet the fun thing is that in California, we have declared a shelter crisis. And so if a city declares a crisis, then they have the power to waive all local rules and regulations that in any way would hinder their ability to deal with the crisis. They waive zoning, they waive CEQA, they waive the neighborhood reviews, they waive the requirement to have electric vehicle chargers. They waive all of that nonsense and focus just on safety. And that allows us to build these instead of $1 million a unit for $50,000 a unit. And we build with relocatable, prefabricated modules. The nice thing is that in today's day where we have the ADU law, there are thousands of those companies out there. There's plenty of variety to choose from. So we do relocatable modules that can literally be picked up with a forklift and moved when John Sobrato needs his land back. And then you look at the neighborhood resistance, and San Jose has been brilliant about this, which is that a neighborhood that's willing to let the interim housing happen, they're the ones that see the visible and measurable difference. We start to invite in the people sleeping in that immediate area, and then you cordon it off and enforce so that that neighborhood benefits. And I'll tell you, when we went to San Jose to get approved for our second project, the only people who showed up angry were people who were pissed it wasn't in their neighborhood. So
Wow.
NIMBYism
That's
can be
amazing.
harnessed, not fought.
That's amazing.
But
That's
then
amazing.
Via del Oro is a great example. It's an acre of land. It's, about 100-ish units. Everybody gets their own room, although couples, you think about privacy. Another reason you don't want to go to a shelter, right? These are humans. So you can be alone with your partner. Dogs, technically, you usually can bring your pet to a shelter, but it's put in a kennel, right? So now you've got your pet and you can have your partner, you can lock your door. So people have their own private space. It's about the size of a college dorm room, right? It's got a bed, a desk, a heater, a door, and a window. What else do you need? But then just like college, we have a shared bathroom building that has bathroom shower stalls and laundry, shared dining facilities. And that community living is very purposeful because we learned that, when people are in encampments, the community is literally survival. If you don't have somebody watching your back, you may not make it through the night. And so folks really do better when they are together. And just like freshman year at Stanford, I didn't have my own bathroom and kitchen. That was a feature, not a bug. You were supposed to have to come out and interact with people. And so that blend of private space and yet community structure and community living is really magical for folks. It's the right blend. And then there's 24/7 staffing, security, case management. Part of the trade is that if you're going to get your own room with a comfy bed and 3 meals a day, you will work with your case manager. And you're assigned to somebody who's not going to tell you what you have to do, but we're going to ask what you want to do, and we're going to hold you accountable to get moving in that direction. So, they're basics, but like you don't think about it, but getting a legal ID, if you've lost your driver's license, like, how can you ever rent an apartment or anything? But they don't know how to find a birth certificate and do all those applications. You're going to get your legal ID. Get in my car. We're going to the DMV, right? You're
Right.
going to enroll in all the benefits that you're eligible for. And if you get those basics going, once people been there for a month, it takes a while. All of a sudden now, their brain does start thinking about maybe I could reunite with my family. Mom will never forgive me, but maybe, maybe I could enroll in that job program.
Amazing. How do you deal with security and with what you identified as the one third of the population that started as 17% on the street, developed mental illness issues after a month or two, now find their way into one of your communities? How do you deal with that subset of the population and their interaction with the rest?
Right. And it's a little worse than that even because when someone becomes homeless, they get assessed and they get assigned a vulnerability score, which is, as you can imagine, how long they've been on the streets and how traumatized they are. And the people with the highest vulnerability score are the ones that get the placements. And so you tend to get folks who have pretty much suffered, right? And yes, they're using drugs, obviously, right? And so one of the things that I think is most tragic is that we score these homelessness services agencies on what percent got back on their feet. Well, if you hand them somebody who's been on the streets for 10 years, that's not a fair score, right? And
Mhm.
so, but the beauty of interim housing is if you think about it, it's kind of a stabilization and sorting time where you get folks in and stabilized, and now you can assess which ones are going to need permanent care, which ones could get back on their feet. But you have to have a chance to get folks stabilized first. And then the ones that are going to need long term care get put on those waiting lists, right? And I think, one of the things that's most compelling to me about this whole concept is that it's kind of like back in the pandemic when we had a shortage of respirators. We had to make the ethical decision: do you give them to the elderly who are likely to die anyway, or do you give them to the people who are young and likely to live? And a horrible, horrible moral conundrum. It's very parallel here, which is that when we've got a shortage of beds, we have to give them to the people who are the most vulnerable, which means somebody newly homeless who still has their wits about them has to wait until they don't before they're eligible for a bed, right? There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And the only way around it is to have enough for everybody. And so when you start talking about $50,000 units that you can do in mass scale, now you have the luxury of starting to talk about ending unsheltered homelessness rather than chipping away at it. And the big benefit is that you've got a bed for the guy who became homeless yesterday. And that person has a high probability of returning to being a contributing member of society if we have the luxury to bring them in right away.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's talk about how this scales. Last I saw, 187,500 unsheltered people. I don't know if that number is right or wrong. It's probably, I see you nodding, it's in the ballpark. You're currently serving 1,600. And so, right, we're a little less than 1%. How do we scale this, Elizabeth? And what is in the way of where we are now to scaling this to serve this entire population, and then over time, because we're breaking the cycle, lessen and lessen the population, because
Mm.
we're actually addressing some of the underlying conditions, plus, of course, housing policy, which is a whole other issue in California, where there's been some positive movements with CEQA reform and other in the recent past, but it's just the beginning. But how do we scale? What's in the way?
Well, let me tell you what's not in the way is public opinion and politics. Ironically, if you're the conservative view and you want to diminish the government spending and welfare system, you could not devise a more welfare heavy model than what we have today if you tried hard. Imagine today someone loses their job, they spend a decade on the street at $80,000 a year, paid for by the system and the hospitals. Then they get $1 million apartment and they get cared for at $20,000 a year until they die, which is going to be 10 or 15 years earlier than otherwise, right? That is incredibly expensive, both to humanity and also to our fiscal
For
pockets. And
sure.
so, from the conservative point of view, ending unsheltered homelessness is the fiscally conservative approach. Obviously, on the other side of the aisle, it's the humanitarian suffering that's got to end. It's inhumane to allow people to live in encampments in today's day and age. Full stop. But then you've got the general public who may be ashamed to say it, but as a taxpayer, they feel like they deserve clean parks and sidewalks, and they do. So all of the political views for different reasons converge on a policy of get everybody off the streets, regardless of whether they're in a permanent home. So the only thing not at that intersection is current policy and funding. That's what gives me hope because those can be changed.
Right. So let's talk about that. So, and actually, let me ask it this way, Elizabeth, because when you look at situations, looking at the financial incentives are often a good way to understand why things are the way they are. Who has an incentive right now in California, financially or otherwise, to keep the system the way it is?
I'd like to think that we don't if we're expansive in our thinking. And let me explain that, which is that if we made a shift in policy to where we get everybody indoors, right? Now we're saving money, a lot of money, and we could talk about the math because I'm business school, mine, but we're saving a lot of money and now we can build the permanent housing that we're going to need. And we're still going to need that housing. Those construction jobs are still going to happen, but they're going to be affordable independent units rather than supportive. But then the supportive care organizations, we're still going to need supportive services. But imagine if they were providing those services at the beginning of someone's homeless episode when they have a chance of efficacy. So we're not putting anybody out of business. We're shifting when and how those businesses and that industrial complex provides its services, but in a way that is more effective, saves society, right? And so it's outdated thinking. And we get a lot of this where there's a view that interim housing is competing for funding with permanent housing, zero sum game,
Mhm.
fighting over the pie. And I respectfully disagree because, first of all, if our goal is ending homelessness, we're making it so much harder, if not impossible, to do that because the people we're trying to end homelessness for are degrading before our eyes, right? And becoming more and more expensive every day. And so if we really want to end homelessness, then we've got to get people indoors and stem that damage. In the meantime, it's like if the goal is to win the game, we got to keep the players alive, right? Keeping the players alive is not the end of itself. Ending homelessness is the end of itself. But getting everybody indoors is a necessary precondition.
Got it. Okay. That's so well said. What do you think is the biggest misconception that elected officials, they're not all steeped fully in the reality of this. What's the biggest misconception that elected officials or citizens have about homelessness in California right now?
Well, there are a lot of them. I think
Biggest.
one yeah, right? So, a lot of the politicians are still stuck in the thinking, which is deeply ingrained. The powers that be are still fiercely opposed to wasting money on interim housing because they feel like, first of all, it doesn't solve the problem, it just hides it, right? And so imagine we got everybody indoors. We haven't solved homelessness. We just don't see it and don't think about it anymore. And so it feels like it's a false finish line, right? And so, the alternative is so we're going to leave people on the streets in order to keep the pressure up to solve the housing crisis. Like we can't use people as political bargaining chips. But it's a very valid concern, which is all you're doing is hiding it. You're not solving it. That's true.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
true. And yet, the cost benefit to hiding it means that it's therefore going to be fiscally possible to solve.
Wow. It's like the homeless population as a big pawn right in the middle of a terrible situation. I want to end with this before we do rapid fire, Elizabeth. I know that you have an opportunity for volunteers when you open new sites. And I know you're opening a site. Is it on Cherry Lane in San Jose? And I saw that on your website, your Dignity Moves website, there's an opportunity for people to actually volunteer, to bring gift baskets, to help set up rooms. But how do people get involved, A, in your organization, and B, more broadly in their community as positive activists if they don't have your organization in their neighborhood yet?
Well, the first way is bring us to your neighborhood. Because if you've got vacant land, a lot of wealthy people are land banking for investments. By the way, private investors get their property taxes waived while their land is used for this charitable purpose. And so people who are holding on to land should raise their hand. Or even if you drive by a parking lot of a CVS that closed down, call us, right? That's probably the first way. The second way is from a volunteer perspective, we've lost touch of the fact that these are humans and they want to build their own way out of their problems. And yet we've trained ourselves to treat them like cardboard and rodents, right? And so the first thing is to actually engage with them, look them in the eye, show them that you care. And when we open our communities, we have high schoolers who come every Sunday morning and make pancake breakfast. The guys come on Friday afternoons and make burger night, right? But interact with them as humans because if you start to show that you believe in them, that's a big game changer. It really is. It sounds mushy, but it's really important. And then yes, when we open our communities, we have a program called Adopt a Room where families can go buy the bedding and make a gift basket and, really it's like decorating a college dorm room, but doing it for somebody else. And then of course, one of the other ways is raise the money to build one of these. They're about $50,000 and we've got a peer-to-peer tool, just like when you're raising money for your soccer team. Raise $50,000 and put your name above it. You can decorate the room and really lean in to help getting people indoors.
Very inspiring. I hope people heed this call. All right, let's do some rapid fire. One word, one phrase, your gut reaction. Your queen for a day, the single biggest thing you do to fix this issue.
I would get everybody indoors immediately. And I can go into all the cost benefits and what that saves us, but that return on investment is extraordinary and we can't afford not to do it.
What gives you hope going forward?
What gives me hope is that the status quo is changing. It really is. Finally, we've reached a pressure point where the public has lost patience with this, and we are starting to see shifts where more and more of the programs actually have funding available for interim housing, not just permanent. And gives me hope to see the federal government starting to think that way too.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that people outside of California have about the homelessness issue in California?
Well, I think you mentioned it earlier that people think it's just because we've got sunny weather and people come here because we're loose and allow drugs and it's not the person's choice. It's the fact that we as
Yep.
as policy have been too idealistic and therefore not practical, and we're not getting people indoors.
No, that's well said. All right, let's finish with this. California is fill in the blank.
A state with a lot of potential and a very, very unfortunate blemish that we haven't had the courage to solve, and we need to.
Yes, we do. That's a good call to action. We're a state with all of the advantages, and I think our problems are human made, and we can solve them, and that should give us all hope. Yeah.
It is so self-inflicted, and it could absolutely we could have everybody indoors for $5 billion return on investment in 2.5 years. We could have everybody indoors by this time next year. We just have to decide to do it.
Okay. Well, let's do it. Let's make it happen. All right, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for your work, your service, and this time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.